we have Linda Botts. She is a state shelter coordinator from Virginia Department of Social Services. She is also a former MRC coordinator from the Eastern region. So we're glad to have her back on this side, presenting this information to us this evening. We also have Christina Stark, who is a preparedness field assignee from CDC, and she's working with us here at Virginia Department of Health. And so I will present these two great individuals to you all to present the emergency sheltering information to you all. Again, if you have any questions, put those in the chat box. So I will turn it over to you ladies.
Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Botts, and thank you for your gracious introduction, Adrenia. Before I came to state work with DSS, I worked with VDH as the Norfolk MRC coordinator. I've done some time with local emergency management, and most recently, before DSS, I was in Virginia Beach as their shelter coordinator. So I have some local experience, and I'll be sharing a little bit of that with you tonight. Super excited to be here talking with the MRC again. You guys are some of my favorite people. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to talk tonight. I'm going to talk tonight specifically about shelter services and functions, realizing that shelters look different everywhere. There are some common things that we'll be talking about, and we'll also cover general shelter roles as well. Next slide. So what do shelters provide? We think of shelters as being, big rooms with cots in them, and they obviously are that. But they also provide meals to people. They provide assistance with medical equipment, places for people to charge their various devices, people that may need assistance with prescriptions or other types of support, and referrals to get that support. These are public places. Everybody is welcome, but we need to keep that in mind as staff working there, that these are public places. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Next slide, please. All right, so sheltering is a team effort that involves a lot of different entities. And as I said, every shelter looks different, but most shelters have all of these services in them. So the health department, of course, provides those basic medical services and public health guidance, never more needed than in our current situation with the pandemic. Law enforcement agencies will provide security. Your emergency management agency will provide that coordination link to get resources. Behavioral health and developmental services provides behavioral health support and mental health support. And then animal care organizations and partner organizations with them usually handle pet sheltering. Next slide, please. So we traditionally think of shelters as being, as I said, that big room with lots of cots in it. But of course, the pandemic has expanded our view of sheltering. So now many places have also developed plans for non-congregate sheltering. And they have the option to use them during the pandemic, depending on what the need is. Typically, non-congregate sheltering is prioritized to people that are at higher risk, more vulnerable populations, or who have already been exposed or may be asymptomatic and ill, that sort of thing. So just be aware that we're going to be talking primarily tonight about congregate sheltering, but non-congregate sheltering is an option that some localities may choose to use during the pandemic. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the different types of operations that happen in a shelter, and we're going to go through and talk through them one by one. So next slide. We will start with the activation and setup. Next slide, please. So setting up the shelter, typically as staff, you may be deployed ahead of time to help set the shelter up. And that's great because you get kind of a preview of where things are, what's going on, how they're going to work. And so areas that have to get set up may include the command area where the shelter management team sets up, the registration area, the dormitory itself, the medical area, the screening area, which may be immediately outside or immediately inside the doors, the cafeteria, the pet shelter, And there may be other areas within your shelter, depending on your agency's plan, that may need to be set up. And most of the time, setup is pretty simple. Lots of hands makes for light work. Usually people aren't tasked to do anything too heavy duty. There's enough work to go around that, depending on whatever your physical ability is, you can find a way to help out. Keep in mind that shelter supplies vary locally. Some jurisdictions have plans and have resources to have cots. Some do not. Cots don't always show up when you want them to. Sometimes you have plans to have cots, but they don't get there in time. So just keep that in mind, that resources may vary somewhat. And that may be something that you can talk to your local MRC coordinator about and ask, some more particulars about what the local plan is. Next slide, please. So the first step is registration when people come in the door, and that's just really collecting basic information. Generally speaking, we don't ask anybody for ID or anything like that. Anybody who comes through the door, we assume that they're seeking shelter, and that's what we're there for. So we welcome them in. So generally, most registration paperwork will include very, very basic stuff like their name, maybe a cell phone number, might collect their address, may collect anything about food allergies. And it's a very general assessment of what the immediate needs are. So if I came in and I said that I was not feeling well, and you were registering me, you would say, well, why don't you go see health services when we're done, and they can check you out. So, and a lot of that has to do with information security and privacy. A lot of jurisdictions use Red Cross paperwork. Some jurisdictions have developed their own shelter paperwork. So, your registration process may look a little different in what questions you ask, but that information is generally similar across those various forms. Next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more about registration. Next slide. So you can assume that evacuees are coming, right? But there's also going to be other people coming through your doors. And so you should have some awareness of who else could be in the shelter with you. Obviously, other staff and volunteers from other agencies. There could be evacuees with service animals. There may be evacuees with pets. Your pet shelter may or may not be nearby, depending on, again, what your jurisdictional plan is. You may have media show up to your shelter, and they may want to do interviews. And that is something that your shelter manager will have to talk to you about what your policy is. There may be other VIPs that show up at your shelter, such as local elected officials, that want to know and better understand what's going on, maybe a photo opportunity, all that sort of thing. So there could be a lot of different types of people in your shelter. Not all of them will be there to shelter, obviously. Next slide, please. All shelters have rules. Some rules may vary, but these are pretty standard across the board because most shelters are in schools, community centers, and similar types of facilities. And these rules generally follow their rules as well. So no smoking indoors. Usually they allow you to smoke outside somewhere. No weapons allowed, no alcohol or drugs allowed. There's usually some sort of electronics policy. Some places don't allow electronics at all. Some places, have a different policy. So you might want to check locally and see what your local policy is. Sex offenders are allowed in shelters. Again, public space, just need to be aware of that. They are asked to self-disclose. And I will tell you that from a law enforcement perspective, they are leaned on pretty heavily to self-disclose. And so, that's why we tell people to keep an eye on their children. This is a public space, and, you need to be aware of that. Next slide, please. A word about access and functional needs. You all probably have dealt with this pretty extensively if you've been with the MRC for any amount of time, especially if you've been helping out with any of the vaccination efforts or any of the testing, you know, anything more public. But approximately half of the US population has either a temporary or permanent condition that may limit their ability to take action in an emergency. And that can be anything from a language issue to a pregnancy, somebody who just had surgery, somebody who doesn't have transportation. So that can look like a lot of different things. So when we say access and functional needs, or AFN, that's what we're referring to. And you will have a number of those needs that show up within the shelter environment. Next slide, please. All right, daily operations and dormitory management. Next slide, please. So your dorm space is this big gym, right? It's the big empty room that we've been talking about. Just a little word about terminology. At the state level, we call them evacuees until we check them into the shelter. Once they're registered, then they become residents. You may have your own local terminology, but you know, just a word about that as we go through and talk about this. And when you look at this big room, you know, kind of what comes to mind, and think about all the gyms you've ever been in your life as a kid, as an adult, you know, as a parent. There's usually bleachers, right? And there's usually maybe 2 clear walls, and there's usually not a lot of outlets. And you think of our society today and how dependent we are on electrical items, our phones, you know, our Game Boys, whatever, all of that stuff. And so that's going to be very challenging within a congregate shelter environment. All these people, you see, everybody is ringed around the outside of the room and not so many people in the middle of the room, right? So think about that as you're bringing people into the shelter, kind of what their needs are going to be. It feels kind of vulnerable to be out there in the middle of the floor, right? More so than it does by the wall. So there are things that you have to think about when you're looking at dorm space and how you're going to place people. What is their need? Is there a medical need for them to be closer to electricity, for them to be closer to a restroom, for them to be closer to the exit doors? Those are all things that we need to think through as we're placing people in the dormitory. Next slide, please. All right, so the dormitory responsibilities in a shelter are probably the most comprehensive, and it really all boils down to being able to kind of read the room. It's situational awareness, helping residents to understand, you know, what's going on in the facility, where things are, answering their questions, maintaining safety, clear aisles, clear fire exits, and so forth, conducting head counts. Usually that's done 1 to 2 times a day, assisting them with tasks. People that are in the general dormitory should be pretty self-sufficient. However, that doesn't mean that they won't need any help at all. So maybe you have a person in the wheelchair in the general dormitory, and it's just a little more cumbersome for them to get down and go through the food line. Perhaps that's an opportunity where you can help by asking if you can bring them a boxed meal. So there are simple things that you need to kind of keep an eye on as well. Ensuring the shelter rules are followed, reporting any incidents that may happen, and then problem solving and taking corrective action. So it doesn't matter where you are in the shelter, if you're in the general dormitory, if you're in the medical area, definitely problem solving is going to be your #1 job, and making sure that you're proactive in doing that and not reactive in doing that. Next slide, please. All right, so we've done our shelter and now we're getting ready to transition out and get people back home. Next slide, please. So jurisdictions really vary on discharge. I've worked in some jurisdictions that didn't have any discharge process. People just got up and left, and we accounted for that with a head count. At the state level, we have a discharge process. It's just a couple of simple questions. Where do you intend to go, and how are you going to get there? We just want to know that they have something, we ask if they have any unmet emergency needs, but that discharge process looks very, very different across the state. So just for your own awareness, if you know that somebody has an issue or something and they're not speaking up, that may be a time where you want to advocate for them or something, because it's not always a well thought out process locally in local sheltering. Next slide, please. All right, we're finally ready to throw in the towel on the shelter. We're gonna break it down and demobilize and head back home. Next slide. So if you've ever worked at any sort of operation, you know that when you're tired and you've been there too long, what does breakdown and demobilization look like? It looks like everybody just grabbing everything and shoving it into a box, right? So we want to make sure we don't do that sort of thing in sheltering. You need to inventory whatever you need to inventory, pack things back up neatly, clear stuff up. Essentially, you want to return the facility in the same condition that you got it. So making sure that things are appropriately packed up, and it's not just, throw it all together and try and get out the door. Next slide, please. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about shelter roles. And these are going to vary pretty widely, again, between, go ahead, you can advance, between jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Pretty much everybody has a shelter manager, and the manager is responsible for everybody, for all the staff and all the residents, and all the volunteers. Any problem, any issue is going to wind up going to the shelter manager. So as an MRC volunteer, you may report it to VDH staff, and VDH staff, if they can't, solve it, figure it out, they're going to end up reporting it up to the shelter manager, and it will then become their problem to deal with. The site liaison, and this may have different terminology, but essentially this is the person on scene who is with the site and has familiarity, has keys to the building, familiarity with the building, usually knows the different systems of the building and can turn lights on and off, let you in and out, make adjustments, knows who to call or knows how to fix, bathroom issues and all those other sorts of things that may come up in sheltering. Next slide, please. All right, and then from here is where locally things tend to break out a lot differently. Sometimes we have very specific names for all of these types of tasks that people could be doing. We'll have a registrar, we'll have a dormitory coordinator, and so on and so forth. At the state level, we've combined that all into one, and we call it shelter specialists as general support, and they're expected to be able to do all of those tasks. So again, differences between, and that's something you can check with your local coordinator to find out, kind of how they like to break down the different roles. But these tasks in sheltering, the evacuee registration, anticipating and identifying the needs, providing that assistance and assessment, and helping people connect to services if possible, solving the problems, those are all things handled by those different types of roles. Even if I'm registering somebody, I might still be helping to assess them. If I'm a dormitory coordinator, I'm going to be helping to solve problems. So a lot of those different tasks carry through the various roles. Next slide. So there are other shelter roles out there, obviously, and Christina is going to talk a little bit more specifically about the VDH role and the MRC role. But public health in general, of course, oversees the medical area and the services, including the COVID screening. Behavioral health, again, supports that emotional well-being. In a shelter, you're often seeing people on what is not the best day of their life, right? And it may not be your best day either. It's an emergency and people are nervous, scared. Having to evacuate your house is pretty nerve-wracking. So that's a really, really important component as well. Getting the resources, having them in place, very important. That's what emergency management does. Law enforcement, whether it's your police, sheriff, facility, security, whatever it is, there'll be some sort of law enforcement aspect there that you can refer to for any problems that come up. And animal care, whatever your animal care organization or organizations, plural, is. A lot of places use more than one, that will be helping out with pet sheltering. Next slide, please. And that kind of brings me to the end. I've seen a few questions pop up in the chat. Did you want me to answer those now, Adrinia, or do you want to hold all of those to the end?
If whatever you feel comfortable in doing, I jotted some of those questions down as well, if Christina did not get to those.
Christina, any thoughts? I don't want to interrupt your time.
No, I'm quite all right with you taking those on now.
Okay, let me go back up and make sure.
And Linda, I have a few of those that may help you, so you don't have to search.
Okay, I think I got them.
Okay, good.
I think I got them. So the first one I see is, if you have to evacuate, can you bring a pet as a volunteer? That is up to your own local policy, so check with your local jurisdiction on that. Some shelters are okay with that. Some municipalities have other thoughts on that, so you need to check with your local policy on that. Do we ever background check? We do not background check evacuees. Background checks do cost money, and they do take a little bit of time if you're going to do any sort of reasonable background check. And our job is really to provide a safe environment. That's job one for everybody. It doesn't matter what your background is. Everybody deserves safety during a storm. And so, no, we do not do background checking. And I am not aware of any local jurisdictions that do. If they're out there, I haven't seen them yet. Are service animals and registered emotional support animals allowed to stay in the shelter with the owner? So this is a loaded question, and I'll give you the simple version, and I'll refer you to a resource where you can get more information. Service animals are defined by the ADA as either dogs or miniature horses, and that's it. So there's only two questions that you can ask with a service animal, and that is this animal trained to perform a task to assist you? And if they say yes, you can ask what the animal has been trained to do. And keep in mind that the animal may have been trained to do something that they cannot demonstrate for you, and you cannot ask them to demonstrate it for you. The animal might be trained to alert to a PTSD issue or something like that. That's not anything anybody's going to be able to show to you. And you cannot ask them for that. So if they say yes to those two questions, we consider, and then it's a dog or a miniature pony, we consider them to be a service animal, and we can let them into the human shelter. Any other type of animal, emotional support, therapy animals, anything else is not considered a service animal and will not be allowed in the shelter. And that's the legal mandate. Typical COVID-related safety measures used in a large gym type shelter. They are the same measures that you use in practice and have been using and practicing for the last 18 plus months. Masks will be required. Social distancing will be required to some degree. Most shelters are planning to segregate people somehow, whether they put up barriers or whether they just make extra wide aisles, something to create that extra sense of space. There'll be enhanced cleaning, hand sanitizer and so forth available. So all the things that you've been doing are things that you'll continue doing within a shelter environment. Since most electronic devices needing charging, can the shelter run electrical cords and power strips to put in the middle of the shelter areas? Depends on the building and the agreement with the locality. And I'll give you a state example. I have one state shelter that will not allow us to run power cords for a lot of reasons. But you have to think, first of all, that they're trip hazards, even if they're taped down. And they can be fire hazards as well. So most places will let you use some. but you got to be careful of having electrical octopuses and things like that. So just some things to be aware of. Again, that you should check with your local policy on that. Let's see the answer on emotional support animals. Yes, they are definitely with the pet shelter. And is that it? Did I get everybody's questions? Is there anything else that I'm missing? Sex offenders are supposed to identify themselves. Yes, it is not a legal requirement. It's not written into code, but their corrections officers and so forth are in very constant communication with them. And they know they will get in trouble if they don't. So who cleans up after a horse or a dog? Presumably the person with the horse and the dog or their caretaker. That's not your job. That's a justifiable, not my job sort of moment. Do we ask about vaccine status? No, I don't believe we will be asking about that. Local policy may differ, but I don't think it will. I think that is now a state mandate that we're not asking. And Christina, if you want to jump in with that, you probably are going to cover that a little bit in yours.
Yeah, no, I can confirm. It may, at the local level, be considered for a screen as part of the screening questions, but it is not a requirement. Certainly not. We won't be denying any unvaccinated folks from entering, and won't be requiring them to self-identify their vaccination status.
Okay. MRC volunteers can assist in winter shelters, that are typically open by local providers. It really depends on what the need is. A lot of times winter shelters are really just warming shelters. They may not be open overnight, so they may not need as much staff. But if the need is there, there's nothing to prevent the MRC from being asked to support that. Segregation of vaccinated versus unvaccinated people, because we are not requiring anybody to show proof of vaccination. There's really not a way for us to segregate that. This is a little bit of an honor system. And it's just like your regular everyday life, where we're going to be enforcing social distancing and masking to make sure that we're safe for everybody. Regarding gender identity in facilities, may anyone claim any identity and use that shower, toilet, designated sleeping area? Wow, that is a loaded question. And that is something that is not easy to answer because I can't legally answer for the jurisdictions. At the state level, I will tell you that if you tell me, whatever you tell me is what I go with. So, showers are private affairs. It is what it is. I know that this has been a struggle for a lot of local jurisdictions. So I'm sorry I can't give you a good answer on that. It really is up to the jurisdiction and legally how they want to handle it. Some of it depends on what kind of facilities they have as well. Obviously, if you're using, an open shower, that's different than a closed private shower, and may require, some different thinking. But for the most part, we try and give people privacy whenever we can. We schedule showers if we have to ensure that privacy. So again, you would need to check locally and see what your local policy is on that. Do volunteers sleep at the shelter too? Yes, many times they do. Depends on kind of how big your shelter is and how, if they can accommodate you. But yes, oftentimes volunteers sleep at the shelter as well. A list of what shelters are used in each locality and some examples of reasons that we need to evacuate or have shelters. So yes, each locality knows what facilities they have designated for shelters. Keep in mind that not every shelter may open up. Oftentimes they open shelters dependent on kind of what the situation is. So for instance, I live in Norfolk. I've worked the shelters in Norfolk. we have about 6 shelters, but we don't always open all of them up. And sometimes we open one for one event and open something else for another event. So it's really kind of dependent on the event itself. And reasons why you'd need to evacuate or have shelters could include, as we've seen recently, flooding, high wind events, long-term power outages, that could be due to any number of events. It could be evacuation due to a hazardous material spill, or some other environmental condition. So there's a pretty fair amount of reasons why you might open shelters. It could be wildfires, it could be earthquakes that have, disrupted gas lines. And so, now you have other hazards in the area and you need to evacuate people. There's a fair amount of reasons why you would open shelters. And fortunately, we have not seen a lot of them in Virginia. Doesn't mean we won't, just means we've been really lucky so far. And finally, is there a capacity limit when you're doing head counts? What happens when you're full? So yes, your municipality should know kind of what the limit is of the building that you're using. And your shelter manager should certainly know that. And when you're full, that gets reported back. That's why you do the head counts, because somebody somewhere is saying, oh, looks like the shelter's half full. Looks like this one's 3/4 full. And ultimately, when your local shelters fill up, that's when we might get a request at the state level to open state shelters to support your jurisdiction or your region. So yes, those head counts are really, really important. And finally, do volunteers get assigned based on their background, veterinarian to a pet shelter? Local flavor on that. I would assume so, but I can't speak for every local jurisdiction and their thinking and how they make assignments. Because you are a part of VDH, VDH probably has some say in that. And so, that really comes down to your local health director and how they work with the jurisdiction and share resources with them. Our local animal control offers available to help with pet sheltering. Yes, in some jurisdictions, no in others. It really depends on what their staffing is and what other roles they may have to fulfill. And I think that's all that we have. How do we comply with the Pets Act? Again, you need to check with your local jurisdiction on that. I apologize, I can't give you specific information because I'm talking to such a broad cross section of the state. Different jurisdictions handle pet sheltering differently. Some of them use more private resources. Some of them actually set up a separate pet shelter, much like the human shelter. And there's, various ways to staff all of that. Who's running the shelter at the Dulles Expo Center? That would be the feds. The feds took over that shelter. So that's, it's not considered a shelter, even though it has beds in it. It's considered a transfer point because those people are really just waiting for their a flight out to go to their next destination. All right, so I'm going to answer this last one and I'm going to turn it over to Christina because I don't want to short her on her time, and I'll be around at the end to answer questions as well. Medical supplies available in a facility in a variety of beds needed. Yes, so that is always challenging, especially if you're a smaller or more rural jurisdiction, is to pull some of those supplies in and have them available when you need to do a shelter. So that, again, is something that you should check locally and see, kind of what your local plan is. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christina. Thank you. I will be around for questions at the end if you guys have anything further you want to ask.
All right, thank you so much, Linda. And I just, before I continue on to my presentation, I just want to add an additional point regarding vaccination. So once again, as Linda had said, we are not considering vaccination status for, for shelteries or for entrance into the shelter. We may, however, consider it in localities that have limited non-congregant sheltering, specifically for individuals who are 12 and under. who are unable to get vaccinated. So that may be a consideration, but once again, will not have any say in actually entering the shelter. Once again, my name is Christina Stark. I am a preparedness field assignee from the CDC. I'm working within the Office of Emergency Preparedness at the Virginia Department of Health. And so during my time here, I will touch on some points trying to detail the public health and medical roles and responsibilities within the shelter environment, as well as describe some of the guidance for disaster shelters during the COVID-19 pandemic. So what is VDH's role within shelter? So VDH serves as the lead agency responsible for public health, medical needs within the shelter. So primarily, or really what that means is we coordinate public health, medical and mental health and behavioral health services through VDH, as well as in collaboration with some of our other partners within the shelter. So some examples of how this plays out is we provide health and medical assessments, triage services, first aid, and limited medication administration for shelterees, as well as for staff members, contractors, and or volunteers supporting the shelter. So it's everyone who is within the shelter. We also protect the current health status of shelterees through case management, which could be coordination of behavioral health services, personal care, hygiene supplies, pharmaceuticals, etc. We also offer environmental health services and needs, which could be through the inspection of food preparation, potable water, sanitation, etc. And then we provide communicable disease prevention services through surveillance and investigation, as well as coordinating WIC and nutrition services. So before we dive further into the key public health roles, I wanted to provide a quick background for a key function of VDH's medical role in the shelter, which is maintaining the health of medical needs shelterees. So medical needs shelterees are persons who would need assistance during evacuation and sheltering due to a previous healthcare or behavioral health issue that goes beyond the basic first aid available to the general population shelterees. So these shelterees may be unable to make appropriate arrangements on their own, but it's not to the point that they're acutely ill and that they would require hospitalization. So these folks have one or more medical or psychiatric condition that requires a level of medical care or assistance that kind of exceeds what the general shelter is able to provide. And so I want to reiterate that our efforts within the shelter are intended to maintain the current level of health, safety, and welfare of the medically dependent individuals. And it's for those who will not require hospitalization as determined by our initial public intake assessment. So now we'll go on to some of the public health roles. And we'll start off, of course, with y'all, with the Virginia Medical Reserve Corps. So alongside our VDH shelter staff, y'all serve a crucial role in our medical as well as our non-medical support roles in emergency situations. I'm sure that you've heard this term before, but you all are a great force multiplier, helping to improve and protect the health of Virginians, most of you within your own personal communities. So once again, we appreciate the invaluable work that y'all offer within the shelter, within emergency shelters. And so on to the epidemiologist / communicable disease nurse role. So a district epidemiologist or a communicable disease nurse should be assigned as needed during an event. So the surveillance officer won't necessarily be in the shelter, unless there's an event that needs to be investigated. And their role, in addition to supporting within the shelter, they're also monitoring the health of the community at large surrounding the shelter. So some of their major areas of responsibility include conducting surveillance and investigation for communicable disease conditions, as well as monitoring the health status of the resident populations within the shelters. If a number of folks who are reporting similar symptoms, either at check-in or during the running of the shelter, are reported, then the EPI or the communicable disease nurse would work to investigate and figure out what's going on within the shelter. They also would identify occurrences of communicable disease or foodborne outbreaks, and they coordinate with our state lab to coordinate testing within the shelter to identify the causes of the illness. The EPI/communicable disease nurse would also be in charge of making local recommendations for intervention or prophylaxis when necessary in these sorts of outbreak situations. And then in general, they coordinate with the facility personnel on prevention strategies and any anticipated disease control measures. Okay, now on to our nurses and clinicians, which makes a great deal of the MRC volunteer force. So their roles include first aid, triage, screening, and intake procedures for shelterees. They also provide limited medication administration assistance, case management for shelterees with chronic medical conditions and/or access and functional needs, and staffing for and just general staffing for any of the medical needs that may arise within the shelter. So staffing for shelters should include registered nurse and licensed practical nurses who will all work within the scope of their license and practice. So the scope of practice will be considered during the screening process. So when we're screening individuals, we have to determine whether a certain medical needs shelteree will need to be transferred to an advanced care facility or another shelter if their needs would not be met within the scope of practice for the medical professionals on staff for the shelter that they are being screened at. So,
Excuse me,
Christina. Yes.
Can you just get a little bit closer to the mic? You're going in and out. The sound is going a little bit in and out.
Okay, I'm gonna try and change my audio. Can y'all hear me better now?
It sounds better. Yep. Thank you.
Disconnected.
Can y'all hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So I once again, I want to stress that the shelter medical care is not supposed to be an alternative hospitalization. So individuals who may need hospitalization would be referred at the time of screening. So we cannot do justice to the roles and responsibilities of nurses and clinicians within this training in particular. So for those interested in more information on this role, I'll refer you to the VDH shelter training for nurses, which is linked in this slide. And I believe we'll, yes, and I see that Adrenia has posted that information in the chat box. And finally, the final role we'll talk about today is the role of environmental health workers. So our environmental health staff are those who will primarily in charge of inspecting the safety of our food and water supply within the shelters. They're not required to be on site at all times. They often actually will be doing the majority of their work, if all goes well, rather, if there's no foodborne illness outbreak prior to activation of the shelter. So they'll inspect and ensure that there's available water and safe water and food and as well as investigate foodborne outbreaks if necessary, and provide general guidance in the case of pet shelters for rabies control. And I just want to outline some of the assessments that the environmental health staff will be looking at during their initial assessment, which is ensuring that the shelter and drinking water and ice is safe and potable if necessary, that the shelter health and medical area is up to par, that shelter sanitation is appropriate for the situation. They'll also inspect shelter solid waste generated, shelter childcare area, and the shelter sleeping area. And if applicable, they will also review in coordination with our other partners, the pet shelter area. Now we'll go on to a quick key points for guidance for disaster shelters during the COVID-19 pandemic. So as was noted kind of in our Q&A session, a lot of these guidance points are kind of near what we would see outside of the shelter, but just some quick points, if available and reasonably practicable, and once again, this would be determined at the local level or regional level. Non-congregate sheltering options should be used during the COVID-19 pandemic. So shelter residents with weakened immune systems or families with young children under 12 who are not yet vaccinated should be prioritized for available non-congregate sheltering. Now, congregate shelter facilities should implement distancing among their residents. And so that's, once again, the common or the well-known 6 feet between cots of people from different households. And so then, once again, general shelter guidance in regards to COVID-19. Keep a distance of at least 6 feet between individuals from different households at all times. Encourage consistent and correct mask or cloth face covering use. Rapidly identify, isolate, and test when it's available within your shelter, people with symptoms compatible with COVID-19. In general, promote frequent hand washing and good hygiene practices. Monitor body temperature for all persons that are entering the shelter. So this could be a part of the screening process. And I'll stress once again, do not exclude people who are having symptoms or are testing positive for COVID-19. And then this is where we were discussing earlier, we're not going to consider vaccine status for those who are, seeking shelter, but where it comes into play is quarantine after, which is the recommendation being quarantine after leaving the shelter in accordance with our recommendations, which also state that those who are fully vaccinated against COVID-19 and have no COVID-like symptoms have no need to quarantine. And so once again, here are some of our key points, but we do have some additional training on sheltering during COVID-19, and I believe Adrenia has posted that information or accessing it through Train within the chat box. All right, so now that we've kind of gotten oriented to what the roles are, what we've changed in regards to COVID-19, let's go into some of the preparation. So what to expect in your deployment. So, based on what we've said, it's crucial that, or rather it's apparent that you'll be in austere conditions. So it's, for all deployments, it's important to understand that it's fast moving, rapidly changing, and that you may have limited details based on circumstances of the event. So, based on what what emergency has triggered, our sheltering process. And then once again, I'm sure some of you have already gone through sheltering procedures. So each deployment is different, and it requires, different actions and responses. And, the ability to be flexible and adaptable is imperative to the work. So we kind of want to tell you all that you need to have personal preparedness, set up a personal preparedness plan with your family and with yourself, and ensure that you're ready within an emergency before we actually face that emergency. Be prepared for austere conditions, because you may be deployed into an active disaster or emergency. So it could be a disaster zone. You could face, fallen trees on your way to the shelter, or power could be limited to a generator. Shifts are typically 12 hours long, and we go through a shift rotation process. Lodging can be dependent on the situation. As Linda had said, often it's the case that you will be sheltering. You'll be staying at the shelter in which you're working at. There may be some situations where you can, travel to and from the shelter. There will be communication gaps throughout the process. There may be limited internet services, and because of that, documentation is critical throughout the response. And of course, you have to work within the scope of the assignment, but also be prepared to work outside of that scope when necessary. And then finally, self-care is key, is crucial to working within the shelter and working with your fellow volunteers and staff members and partners. All right, so if deployed, you have to remember that you are part of a team and you are there and should support each other to make sure, self-care is key, but so is caring for those around you, your fellow volunteers and fellow staff members. So we ask that you use your resources and use your knowledge, but if you don't understand something, then please ask, express your needs and concerns in a timely manner. Communicate your successes, but also communicate some of the barriers that you faced, and certainly pace yourself within the emergency, within what is possible within the shelter environment. And when you can, don't take advantage of the time to unwind. Take that time and try and reset yourself. So pre-deployment planning. So planning can happen very quickly. You can get, the notice that there's an opportunity to volunteer at a shelter very quickly. So we ask that if your family and pets are not, if your family and pets are not taken care of, then you won't be able to focus on the deployment. So make sure to include them in your personal emergency response plan to ensure that, once you go to the shelter, you'll have the peace of mind that your family is safe. And since deployments can be for extended periods of time and internet access may not be available, make sure that all of your personal business matters and bills are paid prior to your deployment. Then be sure, this may go without saying, but please clear all your personal calendar of appointments and other obligations during your time at the shelter. And then if required, consult with your work regarding coverage in your absence, and then update any emergency contact information and instructions in case the worst happens. So what personalizing items should you consider bringing to the shelter? So you know, really stress bring boredom busters. So you can bring headphones, you know, music, cards, books. Keep in mind that that internet may not be working, and the shelter may be running on a generator, so power may be limited. So just consider that in your choice of boredom buster. Be sure to bring comfortable shoes, as well as a change of clothing and a jacket or a sweater in the case of, you know, a chilly shelter. Be sure to bring any sleeping items or any personal hygiene items that you need for your own sleeping habits, your own routine, you know. Be sure to bring your cell phone and your charger. We know it's crucial lifeline to connect with friends and family outside of the shelter. So it may be a crucial, maybe a big lifeline while you're at the shelter. Then consider bringing a flashlight and extra batteries, rain boots and a raincoat, snacks, especially because meals provided may be all the food you have while you're there. So if you have any comfort food that you would want to bring, this now might be the time to consider packing it. And then, of course, any medication that you need to take. So there's something to be said about best laid plans. You know, certainly, as you can see from Linda and my presentation, lots of thought has gone into preparation of shelter function. But sometimes things, or oftentimes really, things do not go as they're expected to. So what you can expect is constant change. You may have the sensation of rushing to get somewhere or to get something done, and then once it's done, waiting to complete it or to complete the task at hand. Then it may be the case that what you were initially asked to do may be different than what you end up doing. Some tasks that you may end up picking up at the shelter based on the needs of the shelter. And certainly be flexible during your time at the shelter, be a problem solver, step up and do what needs to be done. Sometimes that's what's required. And you know, this work, it's rewarding work, but it certainly is super challenging. So stress relief, as I'd said before, cannot stress how much, you know, self-care and trying to, you know, break some of the tension or some of the concern that may come from being in an emergency situation, let alone in the shelter environment. It's important to connect with your fellow staff and the partners, you know. And in order to help people, you have to be sure to take care of yourself, you know. So please, when possible, take time to reduce your stress, take breaks when possible, get an appropriate amount of sleep, eat well, and take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. If you take anything from this presentation, take that, to take care of yourself when you're volunteering at the shelter. No, my apologies. And I don't have to tell y'all, MRC, but y'all are team players. Everyone's a team player within the shelter environment. So it takes all of us. We're in this together. I don't have to ask y'all to become team players because y'all already are. You know, it includes us, or rather it includes VDH, it includes our partners, it includes everyone. So we really appreciate everything that you do and have done and are willing to do. And so I just wanted to stress that. And with that, that's the end of my presentation. So I will go ahead and look at some of the questions in the chat.
Christina, I've been answering a few of the questions that I could answer. So if you don't mind, I'll just kind of read out some of the ones that I couldn't answer because there's kind of a lot to scroll through at this point in time. There's been a couple questions about particular roles. One person is asking how they can apply for roles as a volunteer related to epidemiology and surveillance.
So I think Linda had touched on it earlier, where it's kind of to the discretion of the staff, or rather the in particular the medical director on staff, as well as just the health director within the county that the shelter is in. So I think you can discuss that with your volunteer coordinator to see if you can serve in that role within the shelter.
And your volunteer coordinator knows your background. That's all part of, your onboarding into the unit. Because there were several questions that were kind of in the same vein about particular roles. So I'm going to kind of scoot past some of those because I think that your answer kind of applies to all of those. There's questions about how are those with weakened immune systems identified, and is that a registration screening question?
So that may be a registration screening question. I know that we're still, we are constantly trying to tweak that in order to be prepared for shelter screening. So we may be asking some of those questions as it relates to, what medical needs they may need within the shelter, and whether they would be referred to the specific medical shelter area within the shelter. So I think that, so to answer your question, we would try to identify that within the screening process.
Okay, and what about people who refuse to wear masks?
Yeah, so that I think that would be something that we may refer. I think that that's a role that a lot of our partners within the shelter may have. There's we don't have a mask mandate within shelters, but it is good practice, right? And would you say that that's the case, Linda? I mean,
actually, there's guidance out right now that says that in a congregate shelter you have to wear masks during COVID. So that's VDH guidance that's out right now. So locally they should be following that guidance as well, following all the same protocols as I mentioned before. So if they don't wear, if they're not wearing masks, if they're not willing to wear masks, then it may be a situation where I would guess you're going to end up putting them in isolation, or maybe tucking them over into a corner and creating, a bigger social distance zone around them. It really depends on kind of what kind of capacity your facility has to handle that, and what your local policy is on handling that as well.
Certainly.
There's another question about self-quarantining after volunteering. In the case of COVID exposure, is that a mandatory thing?
So for quarantining, if you start to develop symptoms, and you're, or rather, if you start to develop symptoms, certainly, if you're unvaccinated, then that is also something that we're requiring you to do, is to quarantine. If, however, you have a COVID exposure at the facility or at the shelter, and you're not exhibiting symptoms, then it may not be, rather, if you had a exposure, then it would be something that we might recommend. But once again, we do have detailed guidance, and I can post that in the chat box real quick, which can give you more specifics on depending on specifically, like if you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, whether you had an exposure or not. So I will post those recommendations in the chat box right now.
Okay. We have a question. Do not exclude persons who are having symptoms of COVID. Could you clarify that statement?
My apologies. Yes. In that case, so it would be part of the screening process, but it would be a situation in which we would try to isolate them either through non-congregate sheltering, or if the space is available, then we would isolate them within the shelter. And so then we would create some sort of division between general shelterees rather, and shelterees with COVID-like symptoms. And in that situation, then we would, if they're not coming, for example, with a positive COVID test, and it's available to us, then we would look into testing them and further screening them. So to answer that, we would, we have different recommendations as to how we can shelter those who are positive for COVID or have COVID-like symptoms. So that's to say, it's not, we won't be excluding them from sheltering. We won't turn them away when they're being screened.
Pat has said, don't some counties have indoor facilities, must have masks regardless of vaccine status? Yeah, there may be some local protocols in place as well that you'll have to follow.
Right. Yeah.
And those may change over time. So just because you're locally doesn't happen right now doesn't mean it may not happen later on this fall.
Mm-hmm.
Roberta asks, Roberta says, I would imagine that a known COVID exposure would follow existing CDC rules.
Correct. Yeah, so we would be using the terms, or rather we would be following CDC guidance on what it means to be exposed, and what symptomatic what symptoms are that are presented would be COVID-like symptoms.
Okay. Robert says, I haven't seen any local deployment requests for shelter volunteers or help for storm issues in other states, regions. How do we find these opportunities? Robert, the MRC is really, the MRC of Virginia, like the MRC everywhere, is really a local resource. So you're really there to help your local jurisdiction first. You may get regional requests. And on super rare occasions, there may be state requests, but generally we don't send MRC volunteers out of the state to assist. That has happened, but it's very, very rare. And we haven't gotten any requests. Sometimes we get sent out of the state as state employees to help. We haven't gotten any requests for that either. So, if the opportunity is there, you would definitely hear about it through your unit, that they're looking for additional support to go outside of your jurisdiction, perhaps, and do more. But that's how you would hear about it. Some comments. Will the MRC require all volunteers to be vaccinated for COVID?
I think that would be based on MRC guidance, or rather based on local jurisdictional guidance. I haven't seen any mandates for MRC volunteers, or even for staff. However, Commonwealth, state of Commonwealth employees do have a vaccine mandate. So our partners within each of the state agencies have that mandate. I'm just not sure what the mandate is for our own MRC staff.
Okay. Charlie has commented that many of the answers are wishy-washy, and I agree, Charlie. I wish we could give you good, firm information about your particular jurisdiction. Unfortunately, from my perspective, I know that every jurisdiction is very different in how they approach some of these things. So I can't give you particulars, and Christina, if you have anything you want to add to that, there's a lot of local decision making that goes into shelters. And unfortunately, I can't present that comprehensively in this type of seminar.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. We're trying to present to you, what is standard at the state level, but there's certainly a lot that is up to the jurisdiction.
A couple people have commented that it is in the MRC application. You're asked if you're willing to deploy elsewhere outside of your jurisdiction. That is true. So you have the opportunity to note that there and be available if those requests comes in. Charlie says, so as everything is based on local jurisdictions, why take the course? The course is really to give you an overview of sheltering operations. There are some common themes in sheltering operations, and VDH especially is really one of the only state agencies that has a pretty solid role that looks very similar from local sheltering to state sheltering. There's really not any other state agencies that I could say that about. So there are some common things. We're presenting the common things, but there are a lot of very jurisdiction specific